Rain had a way of making everything feel cinematic, and the morning I pulled up to the Owens estate for the first time, it was coming down in silver curtains so thick I could barely see the iron gate through the windshield. I sat in my second-hand sedan with the heat blasting and a folder of freshly printed resumes on the passenger seat, telling myself this was just a job interview, just another job. Nothing special about it. My name is Alan Davison. I was 26 years old, newly certified as a professional chauffeur after 3 years of driving long-haul freight, and I was 6 weeks pregnant. Nobody knew that last part yet. Not my sister, not my best friend Carla, not the OBGYN I'd scheduled an appointment with for the following Thursday. Nobody. Just me and the little secret that had, in the past 2 weeks, completely dismantled every plan I thought I had for my life. The pregnancy was the reason I needed this job. The private chauffeur position paid nearly triple what I'd been making. Full benefits, housing stipend, a private apartment on the estate grounds for live-in drivers should they choose it. I had chosen it without hesitation because my lease was up in 6 weeks and my savings account had exactly $412 in it. And babies, as I had recently learned in a breathless, terrified hour of internet research, cost an ungodly amount of money. So I was going to get this job. I had to. I pulled through the gate when it buzzed open and parked where the housekeeper had instructed me to park. Got out into the rain, yanked my long pea coat tighter around myself, and walked up the stone steps to the front door. The coat was 3 sizes too large. I'd borrowed it from Carla specifically because it was shapeless and enormous and hid the slight, very slight, barely there, rounding of my lower belly that had started appearing in the last 10 days. I was still in the stage where I could convince myself it wasn't showing. The coat helped me believe that more firmly. The housekeeper, a brisk woman named Mrs. Alcott, who moved like someone who had eliminated all unnecessary motion from her life, showed me to a sitting room and offered me tea. I accepted because my stomach was rolling. Morning sickness that had, with characteristic cruelty, decided that 10 a.m. was its favorite hour, and the warmth of the cup in my hands helped. I was sitting there, trying to look composed, when the door opened. Fred Owens walked in, and every thought I'd prepared evaporated. I had done my research. I knew he was 32, that he ran Owens Capital from an office downtown, that he was the youngest in his family and had inherited the estate 4 years ago. What the professional headshot on the company website had not prepared me for was the reality of him. Tall in a way that filled the doorway, dark hair, slightly damp from the rain, wearing a charcoal suit with the jacket abandoned somewhere and his sleeves rolled up to the elbow. He had the kind of face that looked carved, jaw sharp, cheekbones catching the gray morning light, and dark eyes that swept the room with an efficiency that felt almost predatory. Alpha. The word surfaced in my mind before I could stop it, not as a judgment, just a recognition. There was something in the way he carried himself, an absolute certainty about the space he occupied that made the word fit like a key in a lock. He looked at me, and I stood up. Alan Davison. I extended my hand. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. He crossed the room and took it. His grip was firm and brief. Fred Owens. He gestured for me to sit again, which I did, and he took the chair across from me rather than putting a desk between us. No power games in the seating arrangement. I noted that. You drove freight, he said. Not a question. He'd read my resume. Long haul, 3 years. Yes, cross-country routes mostly. Night driving on mountain passes, monsoon conditions in the southwest, ice on the northern highways. I have a clean record, no accidents, no citations. Why the switch to private chauffeur work? This was the question I had prepared for. The real answer, because I'm pregnant and terrified and I need health insurance and a stable address, was not available to me. I'm ready to stop living out of a truck cab, I said. I've been saving. I want to build something more permanent. Private driving is a profession with long-term relationships. I'm good with people and good under pressure, and I'd like a position where both of those things matter. He studied me for a moment. Not unkindly, more like he was simply deciding what was true. The previous driver, he said, was with me for 7 years. He retired to be closer to his grandchildren. The person I hire needs to understand that this isn't a 9 to 5. My schedule is irregular. Early mornings, late nights, last-minute changes. I travel several times a year. If I need a driver, I need one. I understand that. I don't have children. True. Yet. My schedule is yours. He didn't react to that with anything visible, just continued his study of me. I became suddenly acutely aware of the coat, the massive, shapeless, borrowed coat I was still wearing because I'd been too anxious to take it off. It was warm in the sitting room. I was almost certainly sweating. You can keep the coat on, he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been amusement. Mrs. Alcott keeps this room too warm in the morning. I've argued with her about it for 4 years. I laughed, surprised. It was a real laugh, not a performance. Something in the room shifted. The interview lasted 40 minutes. He asked good questions, not gotcha questions, but the kind that were designed to understand how I actually thought. What would I do if the route was blocked and there were no alternatives on the map? Had I ever driven someone in a medical emergency? How did I handle a passenger who was on an important call and needed silence maintained for an extended period? I answered everything honestly. He nodded occasionally, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he'd been listening carefully. At one point, Mrs. Alcott appeared and refilled my tea without asking, and he held up 2 fingers and she refilled his as well, and neither of them exchanged a word, and I thought, there's a household that runs on long-established trust. That meant something. At the end, he stood and I stood. I'm interviewing 3 other candidates this week, he said. You'll hear from me by Friday. I heard from him on Wednesday. The job was mine if I wanted it. I wanted it. I moved into the driver's apartment on a Saturday, 3 weeks before I was officially due to start. Fred Owens had offered the early move-in unprompted. Mrs. Alcott had relayed the offer with the implication that it was not up for debate, and I had accepted with relief so profound it made my knees weak. The apartment was above the 4-car garage, accessed by an exterior staircase. It had its own entrance, its own kitchen, a small sitting room, a bedroom, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that I fell a little bit in love with immediately. It was clean and quiet and mine, and I stood in the middle of it, with my duffel bags and my single box of kitchen things, and I put my hand on my stomach. Just for a moment, just the two of us, and whispered, "Okay, we're going to be okay." I was almost 11 weeks along. The morning sickness was beginning to let up slightly, replaced by an appetite so aggressive it startled me. I was eating constantly, quietly, in the private of my apartment. The rounding of my belly was still subtle enough that layered clothing concealed it, but I was aware that this window was finite. I would need to figure out what I was going to say and when I was going to say it. My driving duty started on a Monday. Fred left the estate at 7:30 every morning in a black SUV that was 6 months old and immaculate. He worked until at least 7 in the evening, sometimes much later. He had a specific coffee order from a specific cafe 3 blocks from the office. Medium, no sugar, a splash of oat milk, that he wanted waiting when I picked him up. I learned this from Mrs. Alcott, who had a thorough briefing document that felt like a small novel. The first morning, I handed him the coffee when he climbed into the back seat. He took it, glanced up at me in the rearview mirror, and gave me a nod that I understood to mean, correct. We drove the 20 minutes downtown in silence. He read from his phone. I drove. It was, by any measure, a completely unremarkable morning. And yet I spent the drive hyper-aware of him, in the way you are hyper-aware of something your body has decided is important before your mind has caught up. Weeks passed. I learned him the way you learn any landscape you navigate daily. The moods, the textures, the places where caution was warranted. He was quiet in the morning, sharper in the afternoon, occasionally irritated in the evenings after long days that involved his board of directors, who I gathered from context were a collection of people he found professionally frustrating. He rarely vented, but once after a particularly bad meeting, he sat in the back of the car for a full minute after I'd parked in the estate drive, doing nothing, and I sat in the front and did nothing either. And then he said, "Thank you, Alan," and got out. I didn't know what I was being thanked for. The driving, presumably. But it felt like something else. I was 13 weeks when I had my first real prenatal appointment. I drove myself. On a morning Fred was in a video conference at the estate and didn't need me. I sat in the waiting room in my big coat. I had 3 of them now, having quietly acquired my own shapeless, concealing options at a discount clothing store, and stared at the pamphlets about prenatal nutrition, and tried to feel like an adult person making adult decisions. The ultrasound technician was cheerful. She showed me the screen. She pointed at the small, swimming, impossible shape and said things like looking good and strong heartbeat, and I nodded, and then I cried a little bit in my car in the parking garage afterward, which I permitted myself for exactly 7 minutes before I drove home. 14 weeks, 15, my belly was definitely rounding now. Not enormous, not even obviously pregnant to a stranger passing me on the street, but to someone who looked at me carefully and knew my body, it was visible. I began wearing the coats indoors more often. I told myself this was because the garage apartment ran cold. The garage apartment did run cold in autumn, but that wasn't why. Fred noticed the coats. Of course he did. He noticed everything, quietly and without announcement. One morning in the car, early, the lights still gray and thin, he spoke without looking up from his phone. "You wear a lot of layers." "I run cold," I said. A pause. "The garage apartment, Mrs. Alcott mentioned the heating system in that building, is older. I can have someone look at it." "It's fine," I said quickly. Too quickly. "Genuinely, it's fine. I just like layers." He looked up then, met my eyes in the mirror. Something flickered in his expression. Not suspicion, more like a note being filed somewhere. "All right," he said. He had someone look at the heating system the following week. They upgraded the thermostat and replaced two vents and left me with a garage apartment that was, objectively, more comfortable than a five-star hotel. I stood in it that evening and felt something warm and confusing in my chest that I decided to categorize as gratitude and nothing more. 16 weeks. 17. The swell was undeniable now, at least to me. I wore the biggest coat to every work interaction. I had taken to leaving the car to open Fred's door with my left side angled slightly away, maintaining the visual line that the coat was simply the coat. I ordered stretchy, high-waisted trousers in dark colors online and wore them with long, untucked shirts beneath the coats. I was an expert in strategic layering. The problem, the specific, particular problem I had not fully anticipated, was that Fred Owens had apparently decided that his new driver's extreme preference for voluminous outerwear was simply a personality trait to be respected and accommodated. And he had accommodated it in increasingly thoughtful ways that made everything worse. He had the car interior temperature adjusted to a degree warmer each morning and told me through Mrs. Alcott, without explanation, that this was now the standard. When we attended a formal event, and I'd been uncertain whether the coat would be appropriate, he appeared at the car door before I could hesitate and said, without ceremony, "Dress code is flexible. You're staff, not a guest." As if reading my anxiety from 40 feet away. Once, a colleague of his, a broad, loud man named Garrett, who I privately found insufferable, made a comment in my hearing about the coat. Something along the lines of, "Your driver dresses like he's in perpetual February." He thought it was funny. Fred turned the same precise, measured gaze on Garrett that he used on quarterly reports and said, "Alan dresses appropriately for his job." And Garrett stopped being funny very quickly. I thought about that moment for days. I was not, categorically and with great personal emphasis, falling in love with my employer. I was not. I was a practical person in a practical situation, making practical choices, and what I felt when Fred Owens quietly made space for my inexplicable layering habit was professional appreciation and nothing more. I told myself this. I told myself this while eating crackers in bed at midnight because the baby had decided to begin what felt like an internal renovation project. I told myself this while lying in the clawfoot tub with my hand on the hard, curved geometry of my belly, watching the bathwater ripple. I almost believed it. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Thursday night in November. It had been forecasted for 2 days, and Fred had an early morning flight the following day, a weekend trip to meet with a property development group 3 states away. I'd already confirmed the airport route, checked the car, reviewed the terminal layout, everything was organized. The storm arrived 8 hours ahead of schedule. By 9 in the evening, the estate was taking wind gusts that rattled the garage apartment windows in their frames. The rain was coming sideways, and the power had flickered twice. I was in bed, 20 weeks along and currently experiencing what pregnancy books referred to, with infuriating cheerfulness, as the quickening, which meant the baby had begun to move in ways I could feel from the outside, small flutters and nudges that were entirely miraculous and absolutely inconvenient for maintaining my composure. My phone lit up. A text from Fred. "Power's out in the main house. Mrs. Alcott is at her daughter's. Generator will take 20 minutes. Are you all right up there?" I stared at the message. He was checking on me. In a blackout, in a storm, he was checking on me. "Fine up here," I typed back. "My apartment's on a different circuit. I have power. Do you need anything?" A long pause. Then, "No, I'm all right. Stay in if you can." The forecast worsened. I put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. The baby nudged me from the inside, a small, insistent pressure just below my ribs, and I pressed back with 2 fingers, the way I'd gotten into the habit of doing. "I know," I muttered. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my apartment door. I was in my pajamas. Oversized, loose. The kind specifically designed for a pregnant person that I had ordered online and been grateful for every single night. My belly was visible. Obviously, unambiguously visible, a clear and unmistakable convex curve against the soft gray fabric. I didn't think. I just opened the door. Fred stood on the exterior landing in the rain, holding a flashlight, wearing a dark sweater, and looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The storm was loud around us. Rain hammered the stairs. The flashlight beam caught the water running off the eaves in silver lines. His eyes dropped. Not intrusively, not rudely, just the natural downward glance of someone who has suddenly registered something that was not in their mental model. And then came back up to my face. "Alan," he said. "Fred." My voice was steady. My heart was doing something complicated. "You're," he stopped. "Pregnant." I finished it for him, because the word was going to have to exist in the air between us eventually, and I could not bear the moment of his finding it. 20 weeks. I know that I should have disclosed. I've been meaning to. I kept meaning to. The words came out honest in a way I hadn't planned. I was afraid of losing the job. His expression had shifted. He was doing the thing he did when he was processing significant information. Very still, very quiet, everything internal. The rain came down. I was standing in my doorway with my very pregnant belly and my maternity pajamas and nowhere to hide, and I waited. "Can I come in?" he asked finally. I stepped back. He stepped in. I closed the door against the storm. He stood in my small sitting room, dripping slightly, looking around at the space that was mine. The books on the shelf, the baby name list I had not thought to hide, pinned to the corkboard by the kitchen, the small pile of prenatal vitamins on the counter, the single pair of tiny socks I had allowed myself to buy, sitting on the windowsill because I liked looking at them. He looked at the socks for a moment. "You've been alone with this," he said. Not an accusation, just an observation. And somehow that, the simplicity of it, the accuracy of it, was what broke the composure I'd been maintaining for months. "Yes," I said, and my voice cracked on it. He turned around, looked at me, and then he crossed the room in 3 steps, and without asking, without any ceremony at all, he put his arms around me. I went absolutely rigid with surprise. Fred Owens did not. In 5 months of working together, he had never once. He was not a person who touched people. He was careful about space, careful about boundaries, consistently and professionally courteous. But he was holding me now, arms solid and warm around my shoulders, his chin dipped toward the top of my head, and after a rigid, bewildered moment, I folded against him like something that had needed to fold for a very long time. I cried, properly, embarrassingly, with shaking shoulders and everything. I hadn't cried in front of another person since the parking garage after my first ultrasound. I'd been holding it together with the structural integrity of sheer stubbornness, and now Fred Owens was holding me together physically, and the stubbornness gave out. He didn't say, "It's going to be okay," or "Don't cry," or any of the things people say when they're uncomfortable with someone else's emotion. He just stood there, holding me, one hand at the center of my back, steady and present, and let me be a mess until I was done being a mess. When I finally stepped back, I don't know how long it was, time had gotten a little impressionistic. He looked at my face without any visible discomfort. "Tea," he said. "I have an electric kettle." I wiped my face with the back of my hand. Generators running. We sat at my small kitchen table with mugs of tea, the storm outside beating against the windows, and I told him everything. The pregnancy test at 6 weeks, the fear, the job interview and the big coat, and the deliberate concealment that had turned into months of practice subterfuge. The appointments I'd attended alone. The baby name list on the corkboard. I was between Arthur and Silas, I said, and he nodded like this was important information. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without making it about himself. When I finished, the silence that followed was comfortable rather than heavy. "How far is the apartment on the market for something with 2 rooms?" he asked. I blinked. What? "You'll need a second room. There's no timeline urgency, but a newborn in a 1-bedroom becomes a logistics problem faster than you'd expect. I looked into it when you moved in. There's a 2-bedroom unit in the north wing of the estate that was used as staff quarters until about 10 years ago. It's been sitting empty. Mrs. Alcott's been suggesting I do something with it." I stared at him. "Fred, I can have it opened and assessed this week. It needs some work, the flooring probably, and the bathroom tiles, but structurally it's sound. It has a separate entrance." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "It would be more appropriate for a child. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." His voice was even. "I'd like to, if you're agreeable." I looked at him across the small table, this man who I had been driving through seasons, who had upgraded my heating without being asked, and silenced colleagues who commented on my coats and checked on me in a storm, and felt something in my chest rearrange itself into a shape that was unmistakably clear. I'm agreeable, I said. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. Almost, the closest approximation I had seen. He stayed until the main house generator was confirmed running, which was close to midnight. At the door, he paused. The coat, he said. What about it? He looked at me at the obvious roundness of my belly, no longer hidden by anything, just present and unambiguous in my soft pajamas. I thought you were cold. I know you did. I thought, he stopped. There was something that might have been wry humor in his expression, directed at himself rather than at me. I thought you just liked big coats. I laughed. It surprised both of us, the sound of it in the storm-loud apartment. I really don't, I said. I mean, they served a purpose, but no, I'm more of a fitted jacket person normally. He looked at me for a beat longer than was required. We'll work on that, he said, and went out into the rain. The thing about a significant secret being known is that it changes the texture of everything around it. The space where the lie had lived, all those months of coats and careful angles and practiced deflections, was now open, and into that open space came a different kind of awareness. Fred knew, and Fred, being the particular person that Fred Owens was, had not panicked or distanced himself or made me feel like a problem to be managed. He had held me in my kitchen and asked about room configurations and talked about bathroom tiles. I was doing something inadvisable with my feelings, and I knew it. The morning after the storm, I drove him to the airport with the route slightly adjusted for storm debris. He sat in the back, reading. Normal, just like every morning. But when I pulled up to the departures terminal and got out to open his door, he paused before getting out and looked at me differently than he had on any of the previous mornings. Silas, he said. Of the two names, it has better weight. I stood there in the cold morning air outside the terminal, holding the door, and tried to locate a professional response. Noted, I managed. He got out, took his bag, walked 4 steps toward the terminal, and then turned back. There's an appointment. You mentioned your next appointment is next week. Thursday. Yes. I'll be back Wednesday night, if you'd like company. Everything in me went very still. At the appointment? He waited. There was nothing performative about the offer, nothing elaborate, just Fred Owens being precisely who he was, someone who had observed that I had been attending every appointment alone, and offering an alternative. The appointment is at 9, I said. I'll drive. He turned and walked into the terminal before I could say anything else, which I was privately grateful for, because I was fairly certain my face was doing something I would rather he not see from close distance. The weekend passed. I rearranged the furniture in my apartment for no reason other than that I needed to do something with my hands. I sorted the baby things I'd been quietly accumulating, the tiny socks, now joined by a small hat, and 2 neutral-colored onesies purchased from a discount bin, and arranged them on the windowsill shelf. I called Carla. Oh, she said, when I told her I was pregnant. Then, oh, and then after a longer pause, how long have you been sitting on this? 20 weeks. Alan. She started several sentences and completed none of them. Are you okay? Yes. I thought about it. Actually, yes. Better than I thought I'd be saying that. Do you need me to come? Not yet, soon. Is there a? You don't have to tell me. There isn't anyone, I said. It was a situation that concluded before I knew. This was true. The person in question was gone from my life cleanly, without acrimony, and had no knowledge and no claim, and I had processed those facts and set them down. A pause. And the job? Are they being decent about it? I looked at the window, thought about Fred asking whether I wanted company at my appointment. More than decent, I said. Wednesday night, the car pulled into the estate drive at 8:40. I watched from my apartment window, not waiting, just coincidentally standing near the window, as Fred got out and walked toward the main house. He glanced up at the garage apartment. I stepped back from the window, then felt ridiculous and stepped forward again, but he'd already gone inside. Thursday morning, he was waiting at the estate door at 8:15, not in the backseat position of a passenger, but standing beside the driver's side, which was unusual. You said you'd drive, I said. I did. He held out his hand in a gesture that somehow made it obvious he meant for the keys. I gave him the keys. He drove, and I sat in the passenger seat for the first time since I'd started working for him, and it was deeply strange in a way that was also inexplicably comfortable. The clinic was warm and quiet. He sat in the waiting room and read something on his phone, and looked from the outside like any other person in any other waiting room. When the ultrasound technician called me in, I hesitated at the doorway, and he looked up. Do you? I started. He was already putting his phone away. The technician was professional and thorough, and clearly accustomed to partners of all configurations attending these appointments. She showed us, that word happened without my planning it, the screen. The baby was 21 weeks, and apparently committed to demonstrating this by moving with an energy I had personally felt from the inside at 3 in the morning for the past week and a half. There's the spine, the technician said, pointing, and there, she angled the wand slightly, there's the heartbeat. See? The sound came through the speaker. Fast, rhythmic, profoundly alive. I had heard this before. I had sat in this room, or a room like it, alone, and heard this sound, and it had been wonderful and overwhelming and lonely all at once. Hearing it now, with Fred standing slightly behind and to my left, was different in a way I couldn't quantify, but felt throughout my entire body. I turned to look at him. His expression was, I filed it away carefully, stored it somewhere protected, unguarded, completely unguarded, for possibly the first time since I'd known him. He was looking at the screen with something open and wondering in his face that he hadn't thought to organize into composure. He felt my gaze and looked at me. The technician printed photos. Fred held one in the car on the way home, studying it with the same focused attention he gave quarterly projections. And I drove, and the silence between us had shifted into something that required a name. I wasn't ready to give it yet. The North Wing apartment was assessed, renovated, and ready by December. I moved in at 23 weeks, into 2 bright rooms with new flooring and a repainted bathroom, and a second bedroom that I stood in for a long time, thinking about how a room becomes a life. Fred had not supervised the renovation. He had a design team for that, but he had, through Mrs. Alcott, asked me about color preferences. I had said warm tones, and the walls were warm, and there were curtains that pooled slightly on the floor in a dusty gold that I had not specified, but that was exactly right. I thought about that. We had fallen into a new rhythm. The mornings were the same. Coffee, the drive downtown, silence that was comfortable. But evenings were different now. He sometimes knocked at the apartment door, sometimes with a reason. There was a document he needed my input on for the estate's transportation arrangements. Or Mrs. Alcott had made excess food and he was relaying the offer. Sometimes without a specific reason, just, are you busy? We watched rain from the small covered terrace off my sitting room. We argued about the name Silas versus Arthur. He remained firmly Silas, and I had begun to secretly agree, but didn't concede immediately because it was entertaining. He told me things about his work, not the confidential financial things, but the human friction of it, the board member who had been obstructive for 3 years, the property deal he genuinely believed in that kept hitting bureaucratic walls. I told him things too, about long-haul driving and the specific loneliness of that life, which was a different kind of loneliness than most people understood. About my family, scattered and complicated. About being someone who had organized his entire life around forward motion without stopping to figure out what he was moving toward. And now, he asked, one evening, when I had said that last part. And now I have a direction, I said. I had my hand on my stomach. I did this constantly now, reflexively, the baby's movement, a background conversation I was always half attending to. Whether I planned it or not. He looked at my hand on my stomach, at my face. He did this sometimes, this careful, thorough look that moved between things, assembling a picture. I had stopped finding it unnerving. I had started finding it the opposite of unnerving. Does it still feel unplanned? He asked. I thought about the tiny socks on the shelf, the ultrasound photo pinned to my corkboard next to the baby name list, which now had Silas underlined twice, the clawfoot tub in the bathroom where I soaked my aching lower back and had the most peaceful 20 minutes of each day. The particular quality of the silence in the car in the morning, which had become one of my favorite sounds. No, I said, not really. Carla came to visit on a weekend in late December. I gave her the tour of the apartment, the estate grounds, the garage where the cars lived in a way she described as honestly nicer than my flat. She shook Fred's hand when he appeared in the estate drive on his way out, said nothing to his face that was incriminating, and then waited until he was gone to turn to me with an expression that was the visual equivalent of an alarm going off. Alan, she said, whatever you're about to. He looks at you like you're a quarterly report he's personally invested in. That's how he looks at everything. No, she said, with great patience, it's not. I've seen how he looks at the estate gate. He does not look at the gate like that. He looked at you like, like you're the answer to a problem he's been working on for a long time. She put her hand on my arm. And you know what you look like when you look at him? No, I said, and I don't want to. Like someone who has decided not to look too much because they're scared of what they'll see. I looked at the main house, at the window of Fred's study, where a light was on. Most good things are, she said, insufferably wise. Also, he upgraded your heating system, unprompted. Alan, the man upgraded your heating system. It was a gesture of professional. He came to your ultrasound appointment and held the photo of your baby in the car. I opened my mouth, closed it. He held the photo, she said, softer now. You told me that. I had told her that. I had mentioned it, briefly, in the same tone I might mention a weather report. And she had gone very quiet in the way Carla went quiet when she was doing significant internal processing. I can't, I said, and then stopped, because what I meant was, I don't know what happens if I'm wrong, and I don't know what happens if I'm right. And I am 26 years old and 6 months pregnant by someone else entirely, and I drive this man to work every morning, and I live on his estate, and if I reach for something and miss, I will have nowhere to land. Carla squeezed my arm. Okay, she said, just let yourself notice what's happening. That's all. Just notice. The baby moved, right then, a firm kick against my palm that was so precisely timed it felt almost editorial. Even the baby agrees with me, Carla said. Christmas came. Fred gave me the holiday week off, organized it quietly through Mrs. Alcott, with the addendum that the estate itself would be minimally staffed and that the kitchen would be stocked, the implication being that I should rest. I tried to rest. I was not, at 27 weeks, sleeping particularly well. The baby had opinions about sleeping positions that did not align with mine. On Christmas morning, there was a knock at my door. Fred stood outside with 2 mugs of coffee, one of the decaf that I had been drinking since the pregnancy, and which he had at some point noted and remembered without comment, and a small package wrapped in craft paper. Merry Christmas, he said. I stepped back to let him in. He set the mugs on the table and put the package beside them. He was wearing a dark green jumper that I had not seen before, and he looked different. Not dressed for work different, just himself, without the suit's professional armor, and the jumper brought out something warm in the lines of his face. You didn't have to. I gestured at the package. I know. I sat down and opened it. Inside was a book, a beautiful, heavy hardcover illustrated atlas of places, the kind of book with full-page photographs and short essays about geography and light and the particular quality of mornings in different parts of the world. You said once, he began, watching me turn the pages, that the best part of long-haul driving was mornings, that there was something about being on the road at dawn that you couldn't explain to people who hadn't experienced it. I had said that 3 weeks ago on the terrace. I hadn't thought he would. I hadn't expected. I thought you might like somewhere to keep mornings, he said simply. I looked up at him. He was watching me with that precise, open attention, and for a moment, the distance I had been maintaining, through carefulness, through sense, through the patient architecture of not quite looking, collapsed entirely. Fred, I said. Alan, he said, I need to tell you something. He waited. I took a breath. I have been quite deliberately not examining what I feel about you, because the situation is complicated, and you're my employer, and I'm pregnant, and I have been operating under the impression that examining it would be inadvisable. Something shifted in his face. And I had a friend tell me recently, I continued, that I should just notice what's happening, and I have been noticing. I looked at the book in my hands, the beautiful Atlas of Mornings, and what I notice is that you have quietly made everything better. From the day you upgraded my heating without being asked to this. And I notice that the day feels different when you're in it. And I notice that I have been quite specifically not looking at you for the past 2 months because I was worried about what I would see if I did. A long silence. What do you see, he asked quietly, when you look? I looked up. Something I want, I said. Something that frightens me because I want it, and the situation, he said, and he moved then around the table and crouched down in front of my chair so that we were eye level, and I had approximately 2 seconds to appreciate the fact that Fred Owens, who was built like something sculptural and imposing, was currently crouching in my kitchen on Christmas morning. And then he said, the situation is that I have been in love with you since roughly the second week of October. The world did something. October, I said, You came back from an errand in a rainstorm, and you were completely soaked, and you still managed to have the car door open before I reached it. And you apologized for the weather as if it was your fault. Something that was definitively now, a smile, moved across his face. I thought, that's a person with a very particular kind of stubbornness. I found it. He paused, chose the word, compelling. You've been in love with me since October, I said, very carefully, and you thought I just liked big coats. I thought you liked big totes, he confirmed. I was attempting to respect your choices. Fred, yes, that is the most you thing I have ever heard. He laughed, a real one, quiet and sudden and genuine, and I realized I had never heard him laugh like that before. Not a polite sound or a brief exhale, but an actual laugh that rearranged his face into something younger. I felt it like a physical thing, like warmth. Alan, he said, when it faded, you don't have to. I'm not asking for anything that isn't freely given. I want to be clear about that. Your position, your apartment, the appointment, none of that was. I know, I said. I know it wasn't. That's not why I. Fred, look at me. He looked at me. He was still crouched at my eye level, very close, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, and the way the morning light from the kitchen window caught the gray in his hair at the temples that I had always found unreasonably distinguished. I am telling you, I said, that I feel the same way, in case that wasn't clear. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was full, rather than empty. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from my face, very carefully, and I turned my face slightly into his palm, like something helpless and unwilling to pretend otherwise. Silas, I said. He raised an eyebrow. You were right, about the name. His thumb traced along my cheekbone, slow and deliberate. I usually am. Don't be insufferable about it. I'll try, he said, and then his hand curved around my face, and he kissed me, gentle and unambiguous, and everything outside my apartment ceased to be interesting for several minutes. January, 29 weeks, 30. The body does extraordinary things, and the primary extraordinary thing mine was doing was expanding with a certainty and conviction that I found both alarming and increasingly like something to be admired. The baby, Silas, we were calling him Silas now, and the name fit like the ultrasound technician had always been about to announce it, was running out of room and making his feelings known about this regularly. Fred had moved his morning departure time back by 15 minutes. Not announced, not explained. Mrs. Alcott just informed me, with her characteristic brevity, that the morning schedule had been adjusted. What this meant in practice was that Fred appeared in my kitchen at 7:15 with coffee and whatever he was having for breakfast, and we ate together, and then I drove him downtown. This was, apparently, the new arrangement, and Mrs. Alcott had the expression of someone who had been waiting for this development for some time and was quietly pleased. I drove him until 32 weeks, when the logistics of sitting behind the wheel became genuinely challenging in a way that pride could not argue with. He handed me the conversation himself, directly, as I was navigating a particularly tight parking structure. You should stop driving, he said. I'm fine. Your center of gravity has shifted. You're compensating with your left shoulder. I've watched you do it for 3 weeks. I turned my head to look at him briefly. You've been watching my driving technique? I watch everything about you. You know this. I turned back to the road. I can drive another month. You can. I prefer you didn't. Not because you're incompetent, you're the best driver I've had, but because you're growing a person, and if something happened because you were behind the wheel past the point of comfort, I would find that, a pause, unacceptable. The word was mild. What it meant was not mild. I had learned to read the distance between Fred's words and Fred's meanings, and they were often significant. What do I do as I'm not driving you? I asked. You rest, he said, as if this were obvious. You prepare. You let me hire a temporary driver for 8 weeks, and then we revisit. And my salary? Doesn't change. Fred, Allen. His voice was patient and final, and I had, over the preceding weeks, learned the particular quality of his patience. It was not the passive patience of someone waiting you out, but the active patience of someone who had already decided the outcome and was giving you time to arrive there yourself. I stopped driving at 32 weeks. Carla came back for the last trimester. She had, without being asked, arranged her schedule to work remotely from my guest room for the final 6 weeks, which she presented as if she were doing me a mildly inconvenient favor, and not as the profound act of love it obviously was. Fred welcomed her to the estate with a quiet competence that involved making sure the guest room had been properly prepared, and Carla arrived, surveyed the situation, shook his hand again, and then found me alone in the kitchen afterward and said, "I'm fond of him. I want you to know I'm now actively rooting." "Noted," I said. "Also, the jumper he was wearing, very good jumper. Carla, I'm just saying, he has good taste." He also had patience and precision, and the kind of quiet thoughtfulness that expressed itself in action rather than declaration. And I spent the last trimester discovering new specific expressions of this. He appeared on evenings with things I had mentioned casually: a particular kind of tea I'd said I liked, a book I'd referenced, a pillow arrangement for the sofa that Mrs. Alcott had implemented and that I suspected had been his instruction. He never made the gestures grand, never called attention to them, and when I called them out, he had the air of someone who was not embarrassed but was perhaps slightly caught. "You're attentive," I said once, when I found a new footrest beside the sitting room chair that was exactly the right height for me at 34 weeks. "I notice things," he said. "You noticed I needed a footrest. You mentioned your ankles." "I mentioned my ankles in passing, 6 days ago." He looked at the footrest. "Is it not the right height?" "Fred," I looked at him. He looked back. "It's the right height," I said. He nodded as if this were the important information and opened his book. I sat with the footrest and the right height, and the quiet, particular warmth of being known in the small, daily ways that turned out to be the most significant. 36 weeks, 37, 38, and I woke at 3 in the morning with a certainty that was different from all the earlier nighttime certainties. The kind of certainty that moves through the body like a tide coming in. And I lay there for 40 minutes, doing the breathing I'd learned in the birthing class and timing things on my phone. And when the numbers said what they said, I picked up the phone and called Fred. He answered on the second ring. "It's time," I said. "I'm coming," he said. He was already awake. I don't know if he was a light sleeper or if he had been awake in the particular way of someone listening for a specific sound. Either way, he was at my door in 4 minutes, dressed, calm, the car keys already in his hand. "The bag is by the door," I said, breathless with something between pain and exhilaration. He picked it up, looked at me with that careful, thorough attention. "How are you doing?" "Ask me again in a few hours," I managed. He drove. I gripped the door handle and breathed and timed, and somewhere around the 8-minute mark I said, between breaths, "You should have let me keep driving. I was better at this than you." "You can tell me that again when we're not in an active labor situation," he said. Perfectly calm, eyes on the road. "I'm holding you to that." "I know." Silas arrived at 11:47 in the morning, after 9 hours that I will not describe in detail, because this is a love story, not a horror story, though I will say that Fred was there for all of it, and that he held my hand with exactly the right pressure for exactly as long as I needed, and did not flinch and did not speak unnecessarily, and that when the midwife said, "Here he is," and placed this small, furious, extraordinary creature on my chest, the sound Fred made beside me was not words, but it was the most articulate sound I had ever heard from him. Silas was 6 pounds 11 ounces and equipped with extremely strong opinions about being in the world and exactly my nose and Fred's steady, watchful eyes, which was, well, it wasn't biologically possible. I knew that. But it's what I thought in the warm and exhausted and demolished first hour of Silas's existence, lying there with this new person on my chest. He has Fred's eyes. And the thought made me feel, absurdly and completely, like I had arrived somewhere. Fred held him after about an hour, when things had settled and the midwives had done their work, and it was just the three of us in the room, quiet and afternoon lit. He held Silas with the same focused, careful attention he gave everything important, both hands, secure and deliberate, the baby's head cradled in his palm, and looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Silas," he said finally. Just the name, testing it against reality. "Told you," I said. I was barely awake. Everything hurt, and nothing mattered except the specific contents of the room. The name fits. Fred looked up from Silas to me. The expression on his face was the same one I'd seen at the ultrasound, unguarded and open and wondering, but deeper now, richer with meaning. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Ask me in another hour, or a year." "I will," he said, completely seriously. Summer at the estate. Silas at 6 months was a project, an opinionated, fascinating, loud, and intermittently delightful project, who is currently demonstrating his mobility ambitions by attempting to pull himself upright against the coffee table leg. I was watching from the sofa. Fred was watching from the armchair, with the specific expression of a person who has restructured several of their foundational assumptions about what constitutes an interesting way to spend a Saturday afternoon. We were in the main house now. We had moved into the main house 3 weeks after Silas came home, a transition that had been handled by Fred saying, "This doesn't make logistical sense," in reference to us being in separate parts of the estate. And that had been, in its Fred-specific way, the most romantic thing I'd heard in my life. Carla said it would make a good story. I said it was not that kind of story. She said all love stories are that kind of story, and also that she wanted to be involved in any narrative retelling. I told her she was already in it. The morning drive still existed. I had gone back to work part-time, driving 3 days a week, while Mrs. Alcott managed Silas with a cheerful competence that suggested she had been waiting for this particular role for some time. The morning still had the coffee, the particular silence, the 20 minutes downtown. But now, at the end of the drive, when Fred got out at the office, he stopped at the car window on the way to the door and said something, a word, a look, the specific kind of gesture that doesn't have a name. And I drove away, feeling the particular weight of being known. On a Saturday in late summer, with Silas succeeding finally in his coffee table ambitions and standing, briefly, triumphantly upright, before sitting back down with a look of enormous satisfaction. Fred moved from the armchair to the sofa and sat beside me. "I've been thinking," he said. I watched Silas contemplate his next attempt at vertical achievement. About what? About whether the coat thing is ever going to stop being funny. I turned to look at him. He had the expression he got when he was enjoying himself with a particular quietness, which was the most enjoyable of his expressions because it was the rarest. "When did you realize," I said, "actually realize, when did you look at me and the possibility occur to you that it wasn't just the coats?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking or remembering. Silas made a determined effort at the table leg. "The storm," he said, "when you opened the door. I thought about that night. The rain, the flashlight, the terrible vulnerability of standing in my own doorway with nowhere to hide. You didn't say anything," I said. "When I opened the door and you didn't say anything. You just asked to come in. What was I going to say?" A pause. "It was obvious." "It was obvious to you." "It was obvious," he said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided this is settled, "that you had been managing something enormous alone, for months, out of fear. And that was not a moment for me to make a speech." He looked at Silas, who had achieved upright again, and was now swaying with the concentration of a very small person discovering physics. "You needed something simple, so I came in." Silas sat down, looked at the table, began his approach again with the expression of someone who has simply decided. "He's very like you," I said. Fred looked at me. Something warm moved across his face. "He does not give up," he agreed. "He gets it from you." I leaned into him, slightly, the way I had started doing without thinking. Just the lean, just the contact, the simple ordinary fact of being close. He put his arm around me, his usual unhurried gesture. "You know what I think about sometimes? Tell me, that morning in November, the day after the storm, you at the airport departures door, talking about Silas's name." "You turned back," I said. "You walked 4 steps toward the terminal and then you turned back." "I merely didn't." I looked at him. "What stopped you?" He considered this. His attention on me had the quality it always had, thorough and specific, but with a warmth underneath it that had been there the whole time. I realize now, from the very first morning of coffee and silence and 20 minutes through the city. "I thought," he said, "that it was possible I was about to spend a weekend not saying something I should have said. And that seemed like poor planning." I laughed. He did too. That quiet, real laugh. "Poor planning," I repeated. "Very poor." Silas made it to vertical for a third time, swayed magnificently, and then sat down with an expression of perfect satisfaction, as if this had been the goal all along, not to remain standing, but simply to know that he could. I watched him. I felt Fred beside me. I thought about the coat I had borrowed from Carla, and the rain on the estate gate, and the folder of resumes on the passenger seat of my old car, and the particular shape of a morning when you do not know yet what it is going to become. "Thank you for the atlas," I said, out of nowhere. He knew what I meant. He always knew what I meant. "You're welcome," he said. Outside, the summer moved through the estate in long golden poles of light. Inside, our son practiced the physics of standing, and fell and stood again, and the morning stretched around us, like something we had, between us, decided to drive toward. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me.